I'm Dr. Hannah and welcome to today's video. I'm going to talk about Fiasp insulin and what I've learned about it with my personal use over the last 2.5 years or so. So Fiasp, if you don't know, is one of the faster insulins on the market. It is kind of considered one of the fastest with Libre, which is the other. And then there's also the inhalable insulins, but we won't kind of be talking about those as much today. I really like Fiasp. It's worked well for me. It gives me more flexibility with my meal timing. And I like the fact that I can predict on it to kick in sooner than Humalog and Novolog. And so I can treat high blood sugars faster, and I can also take my insulin a little bit closer to a meal. Now, what's really interesting, and actually before I jump in, I just want to say yet again that just because I am a doctor, it doesn't mean I'm yours, and it's really important that if you learn something here about diabetes or insulin management that you want to try at home, always talk to your doctor about it before making any changes. So with that though, I think it is interesting that Fiasp manufacturer really talks about the timing recommendation for insulin dosing and kind of what they found in the studies when they went through approval. And their recommendation is to take Fiasp 2 minutes before up to 20 minutes after a meal, with the idea that it starts absorbing into your bloodstream in 2.5 minutes, which is super fast and amazing, peaks in about 30 minutes, and then lasts 3 to 5 hours. So that's kind of the time frame that we're looking at. Now, what's interesting is I found personally, I'm gonna have an average, let's say breakfast, lunch, or dinner, which would consist of maybe a balanced meal, so healthy carbohydrates, a little bit of protein, a little bit of healthy fats. I find that if I were to take my Fiasp 2 minutes before, or certainly 20 minutes after I start eating, I would most predictably have a postprandial spike, which means an insulin or blood sugar level that kind of spikes up after my meal before my insulin fully kicks in. And the reason for that essentially is I've eaten food, I'm digesting it, I'm absorbing the carbohydrates from the meal, right? My body's breaking down those carbs into sugar, that sugar is being absorbed, it gets into my bloodstream. It gets into my bloodstream faster than that insulin fully gets in and starts working. And so what I find is that pre-bolusing with Fiasp is still very important for me. And I've used Fiasp, like I said, kind of 2.5 years now. I've used it injection, so kind of on shots. That's what I'm doing right now. I've also used it in an insulin pump. I used it in the Omnipod 5, which I believe is still not FDA approved for it. So again, that's kind of a case-by-case basis, but I really liked that it gave me flexibility to bolus a little bit closer to my meals and certainly treat higher blood sugars faster. Because if the insulin kicks in faster, right, that higher blood sugar comes down a little bit faster. So what I found though for me is that the pre-bolusing really matters, and the timing makes a big difference on whether or not I have the blood sugars that I'm looking for after a meal. The timing almost makes as much of a difference, or is as important, might be a better way to say it, as the amount of insulin I take, because I really want to try and match that absorption of the carbohydrates to the peak of the insulin. So what I've learned with Fiasp for me is it really depends on where my blood sugar is before I'm starting the meal, as far as when I need to bolus. And I'm about to sneeze here, gosh. So what I find is if my blood sugar is running higher, I certainly can take my Fiasp insulin a lot earlier. If I'm wanting to add on a correction, let's say my blood sugar is maybe 200, and I want to give a correction for that 200 to bring me back down to around 100, and I want to bolus for a meal, I can take all that insulin about 30-40 minutes before my meal, kind of watch it come down, and then start to eat. That works really well for me. If my blood sugar is running low, let's say my blood sugar is 75 down arrow, taking insulin right when I start eating might not be the right thing to do, especially if I'm going to eat kind of a slower carb meal, which might mean a meal that's lower in carbohydrates or has higher amounts of fat and protein that would slow down the absorption rate of the amount of carbs it did have. So with that, it really does depend, but I often take my insulin at least 10 to 15 minutes before my meal with Fiasp when I'm starting with blood sugars that are in range. That's what works for me. I do find though with Fiasp, after being on Humalog and Novolog, kind of back and forth for years and years, I have to be a lot more careful about when I start eating. So I gave this example in another video, but really what can happen is if you are taking your insulin to correct a high blood sugar, or let's say you're just running in range, I take a bolus of Fiasp for the meal. If I get distracted in that kind of time period while I'm waiting, I can go low pretty quickly. So it's just really important for me to be attentive after I take that bolus of Fiasp. I've got that insulin on board for my meal. Really watch my graph on my CGM. Now this can be done with or without a CGM. I think it's really helpful to have one, but essentially what I'll do is I'll kind of look for my blood sugar continuing that kind of trend that it was on, and then I will start to see a dip. So this is when those first few points kind of start coming down, then I know my blood sugar is dropping. It's a great time to start eating. What I like to remind people, and I have to remind myself often, is that most CGMs, well, and it's not really about the CGM kind of brand. I think that's a confusion that I see a lot of people have. It's about the technology and how a CGM works. But when we're measuring blood sugar from the interstitial fluid, we're actually converting it to what the blood sugar would be. So we're measuring the amount of glucose with a CGM in the fluid between the cells, and then we convert it to what it would be in the blood sugar. But naturally in our bodies, the fluid between the cells, the glucose is going to be about 10 minutes behind what the blood sugar is. The blood sugar is going to kind of change faster. And so if we are treating low or we're looking for that bend, we need to understand that the graph is about 10 minutes behind real-time blood sugar. And you may often find that if you are moving quickly up or down, you calibrate your continuous glucose monitor, it's going to be off in the direction of the trend arrows. And so sometimes you may be picking up that 10-minute lag. Now with that, if I am, let's see, 80 flatline and I'm going to start eating soon and I take my Fiasp insulin, I may not wait for that down trend, right? Because I'll know, let me give myself about 10 or 15 minutes. I don't necessarily need to see it on the graph before I start eating, because that might mean I'm already low, right? It might mean I'm already into the 70s, high 60s if I see that trend graph at that time. So there's a lot of nuance to this, and it's really interesting. And the amount of time that I take my insulin before a meal certainly isn't perfect every time. I make tons of mistakes because it is a guessing game. How long is it going to take for it to kick in based on what I did last? How long is my food going to take to digest? There's a lot there. But really understanding that pre-bolusing with Fiasp to me is still a really important part of my care. If I didn't pre-bolus with Fiasp, I have a strong feeling my blood sugars would be a lot more kind of roller coastery, which is not a word, but I think describes the phenomena that most of us are used to or have seen before, which is that kind of up and down swings of a glucose graph over time. If we can really prevent those after meal, postprandial high blood sugars, often we feel a lot better. It's easier to stay off the roller coaster that way too. So pre-bolusing with Fiasp is important to me, 10 to 15 minutes if I am within range, much earlier if I'm treating a high blood sugar, but again, just keeping my eye on the trend graph there. I'm a huge fan of Fiasp in a pump. I found it worked very similarly. I liked that the correction of Fiasp, so correction meaning if my blood sugar is running high, I take an insulin bolus just to correct that blood sugar to come down. I find that my highs are treated much faster, not hanging out in higher ranges for a longer amount of time, and I like that because I feel better. I feel like I've got closer to the control that I want with it. Now, it is completely possible to have great blood sugar control regardless of what type of insulin that you are on. I learned how my body worked with Humalog, and I learned how my body worked with Novolog, which for me were about the same. I know not everyone feels that. And it really is just a difference, in understanding, but they're all possible, to get to a place where you've got the blood sugar control that you want to get. It's really just the process of learning your body, believing in yourself, staying committed to continuing to understand, and knowing that it is completely normal and common to learn by seeing mistakes, or mistakes might not be the right word, having unpredictable outcomes, right? So if I think, Oh, usually it takes me 15 minutes for my Fiasp to kick in, but I forgot that I just came back from a workout. I might take my insulin and then be waiting for my meal and then go low, you know, and have to start eating when I'm already low. Like, okay, you know, I learned next time, maybe I need to reconsider if I'm coming in after a workout. So there are a lot of different things, you know, that can change it. And that phenomena is not just an example. That's something that I've learned, you know, truly for myself. But it is really important to kind of get that understanding that you can do it with any insulin. It's just about learning, and it's a process of trial and error. And that is how we learn, you know, and as long as we are attentive to our blood sugars, we're checking on them frequently, and we're understanding what we need to do in times where they go out of range, you know, it's safe to try, and it's safe to figure it out. And that's really the best way we have, because we can look at those big studies, right? The Fiasp study that said, take insulin, you know, 2 minutes before or 20 minutes after a meal. If I just followed that blindly, I didn't do my own trial and error, I wouldn't get to a place where I really understood how it could work best for me. So I hope this helps you. I hope if you are new to Fiasp, or Fiasp is something you've been on for a while but haven't quite figured out how to fine tune, that this gives you some insight to talk to your doctor about. Thanks for being here. If you haven't subscribed, it would mean a lot to me if you get the chance to, or if you know someone else on Fiasp, or you have a friend with type 1 that's interested in learning about it, anything that you can do to share my channel really helps me be able to make time to provide more videos like this for you for free. So thanks for being here, and I hope to see you next time.